New York was a city vibrating with tension long before most people ever heard the name Lucky Luciano. It was a place where opportunity and danger lived side by side, where the neon lights of nightlife glittered over alleys soaked in fear, and where immigrant dreams collided with the brutal realities of survival. In the early decades of the 20th century, the city felt like a machine running at full speed, steam, steel, ambition, and violence clashing in every corner. As Prohibition tightened its grip on America, alcohol vanished from legal shelves but flowed freely through hidden cellar doors. Behind each secret shipment stood men willing to kill for a cut. This was the world Luciano stepped into, a landscape begging to be tamed by someone bold enough to reorganize chaos into an empire. This story begins not with a single act of violence or a pivotal meeting in a smoke-filled backroom, but with a sensation, a tremor running through the city's criminal underworld. The old Mafia, still clinging to centuries-old Sicilian traditions, was breaking apart. Ethnic factions fought for scraps of power, assassins prowled the streets, and bosses ruled through fear rather than strategy. Every neighborhood had its own ruler, every racket its own bloody guardian. Yet beneath the uproar lay something more profound, a vacuum of leadership. New York was bursting with illicit opportunity, but no one had figured out how to manage it. It was this disorder that set the stage for a man like Luciano, a man who understood that power wasn't just about force. It was about structure. Imagine the city from above. Speakeasies glow through the night, hidden behind unmarked doors. Policemen walk their beats with blind eyes and open palms. Politicians dine with bootleggers, union bosses meet silently with mob lieutenants, and everyone pretends none of it is happening. Beneath the city's surface, a second metropolis thrives, a kingdom of illegal liquor shipments, bribes, extortion, and clandestine deals. But even this shadow world has its cracks. Rival families operate like medieval clans, clinging to loyalty oaths and archaic rules that slow their response to the rapidly changing American landscape. Without coordination, they waste resources. Without trust, they spill blood. And without vision, they remain trapped in cycles of tradition, unable to evolve. Into this world walks Salvatore Lucania, soon to be known to the world as Charles Lucky Luciano. But at this moment he is not yet the kingpin history remembers. He is a young man watching the chaos of the city with sharp, calculating eyes. He sees the reckless killings, the petty turf fights, and the pointless feuds that drain power from everyone involved. He sees bosses too stubborn to adapt, too prideful to collaborate, too rooted in the old ways to notice that New York is transforming around them. What Luciano sees, perhaps long before anyone else, is that the criminal underworld is stuck in the past while the future races forward without mercy. The city streets offer lessons to anyone observant enough to grasp them. Luciano watches the Irish gangs, the Jewish syndicates, the Italian crews, and the independent operations all competing for space. He notices something crucial: the groups that cooperate survive longer. Those that remain rigid fall. Every dead body on the pavement, every headline of a gangland murder, every whisper of betrayal teaches him something about human nature and power. To Luciano, the underworld isn't a battlefield, it's a business waiting to be structured. And if structure doesn't exist, someone has to build it. But the tension in New York is not just criminal, it's psychological. Ordinary citizens sense something shifting beneath everyday life. They hear the gunshots echoing down Manhattan alleys. They feel the surge of corruption in local police precincts. They read sensational newspapers warning of the foreign menace, painting mobsters as shadowy villains pulling strings behind the city's growth. Whether these fears are exaggerated or not hardly matters. Public paranoia becomes part of the atmosphere. New York smells like ambition, danger, and the metallic taste of transformation. Something is coming. A storm is gathering. What makes this moment so cinematic, so emotionally gripping, is the collision of forces. On one side, ancient Sicilian codes: honor, silence, submission to the boss. On the other, American capitalism: speed, competition, innovation. These two worlds do not blend easily. The old Mafia wants hierarchy, the new world rewards adaptability. Between them stands a young man determined to merge both into something unprecedented. He is not yet the legend. He is only beginning the silent, relentless climb toward it. But already whispers follow him. The boy from the Lower East Side with the calm smile. The gambler with an uncanny ability to survive. The negotiator who understands every side of a conflict. Those who know him recognize something unusual, an ambition that isn't loud but steady, a cold intelligence masked by charm. Luciano is not driven by chaos nor by fear. He is driven by clarity. He sees the game for what it truly is: a system waiting for a master strategist. And so New York waits as well, unknowingly standing on the edge of its darkest and most transformative criminal evolution. Rivalries that have simmered for decades will soon erupt. Blood will spill in quiet restaurants and busy streets. Betrayals will rewrite loyalties. Alliances will shift like tectonic plates beneath the city's feet. In the middle of it all, one man will rewrite the rules and reshape the underworld so completely that his influence will be felt for generations. Before the world knew his name, before newspapers sensationalized his power, before law enforcement built entire careers trying to bring him down, Lucky Luciano was simply a man watching chaos and preparing to turn it into order. This is the moment just before the rise, the breath before the impact, when history waits for its architect to step out of the shadows and seize the city that doesn't yet realize it belongs to him. New York's criminal underworld before Lucky Luciano emerged was not a single organization. It was a battlefield disguised as a business. To understand the brilliance of what Luciano eventually built, you first have to understand the chaos he walked into. The city in the early 1900s was a mosaic of ethnic enclaves, each one guarded by small-time gang bosses who operated more like tribal warlords than businessmen. These weren't sleek, coordinated criminal networks. They were volatile, paranoid fiefdoms constantly on the brink of collapse. Violence was the default language, and loyalty was something bought in cash rather than earned through respect. The Italian underworld itself was fractured into so many factions that even experienced criminals struggled to keep track. Sicilians held grudges that stretched back generations, Neapolitans distrusted anyone from outside their village, Calabrians operated in nearly total isolation, and the older Mafia families clung stubbornly to customs brought from rural towns back in Italy. The Morello family, one of the earliest dominant forces, was powerful but fragmented, its leadership unclear, its loyalty fragile, and its internal structure a tangle of cousins, in-laws, and rivals who cooperated one day and plotted against each other the next. Their operations were violent, crude, and inefficient. Murder was common, strategy was rare. Beyond the Italians, New York's underworld was a wild, opportunistic ecosystem. Irish gangs dominated waterfronts and political corruption. Jewish syndicates controlled gambling dens, heists, and intelligence networks. Each group had their own rules, their own territories, and their own grudges. These weren't clean, defined territories, they overlapped chaotically, forcing constant confrontations. Some conflicts were quiet and calculated. Most erupted into street wars lasting weeks or months. No group thought about longevity. Everyone was focused on the immediate score, the next payoff, the next opportunity to expand by force. This lack of coordination didn't just weaken the underworld, it created constant instability. One week a bootlegging pipeline was running smoothly, and the next week it was collapsing because someone's cousin decided to hijack a shipment out of spite. Extortion rackets rose and fell depending on who got shot outside the bar that month. Gambling operations were raided not by police, but by rival gangs looking to squeeze out competition. It was a world where profit was unpredictable, alliances were disposable, and betrayals were expected, just part of doing business. And as prohibition approached, the stakes became even higher. The sudden illegality of alcohol was like pouring gasoline on the criminal landscape. New York became the epicenter of an entirely new economy, one worth millions upon millions of dollars. But the old bosses were not prepared. They approached prohibition like any other racket, small-scale, territorial, and secretive. They didn't think in terms of distribution networks, supply chains, logistics, or political infrastructure. They saw it as an opportunity to squeeze local bars, not to dominate a national market. Their minds were in the past while the country was racing toward a modern criminal boom. What made the situation even more volatile was the lack of a genuine leadership hierarchy. There was no council, no commission, no centralized authority. The so-called boss of bosses was more of a symbolic title than an actual position of power. Bosses demanded respect but rarely earned it. They held on to authority through fear and old-world customs rather than competence or strategic vision. Their power was based on reputation rather than results. This left the entire underworld vulnerable. If a boss made a foolish decision, dozens of operations collapsed with him. If a lieutenant betrayed his leader, the resulting fallout could ignite a full neighborhood war. The public, meanwhile, saw only the aftermath. Newspaper headlines sensationalized every murder, turning gangsters into caricatures, mysterious foreign men with wide-brimmed hats and cold hearts. The truth was more complicated. These were men out of time, trapped between loyalty to the traditions of their homeland and the brute capitalism of America. Their instincts were shaped in rural villages where survival depended on silence and obedience. But New York demanded speed, adaptability, and sharp organizational thinking. And that was something most of the old generation didn't possess. The police were no stabilizing force either. Corruption ran through the department like a second bloodstream. Many officers accepted weekly envelopes from gambling dens, brothels, and bootleggers. Others acted as personal muscle for certain gangs, arresting rivals and ignoring certain crimes. Still others were simply incompetent or overwhelmed. The justice system was a revolving door. Mobsters were arrested, paid their way out, and returned to the street within days. This meant the underworld was never forced to evolve. It simply rotated through cycles of violence and bribery. Within this environment, violence became a kind of currency. If someone insulted a boss, he was killed. If someone refused to pay protection money, he was beaten. If a rival made too much profit, his business was bombed. There was no long-term thinking, no central strategy, no structure for mediating disputes. Everyone acted independently, guided only by personal pride, cultural memory, and momentary opportunity. Even successful bosses spent more time dealing with petty disputes and enforcing loyalty than building sustainable operations. The danger of this world wasn't just physical, it was psychological. No gangster could sleep peacefully, no alliance was truly safe, no operation was guaranteed to last. Fear permeated everything. Men trusted no one and suspicion was constant. The slightest rumor could lead to assassination. Paranoia was more common than loyalty, and many mobsters lived knowing their closest friend might one day become their executioner. This chaotic underworld would become Luciano's greatest advantage. While others saw disorder, he saw potential. While others clung to outdated rules, he saw outdated weaknesses. And while others reacted emotionally to insults or threats, he observed how power truly moved, quietly, strategically, through alliances, economics, and organization rather than impulsive violence. The city's criminal landscape was broken, fragmented, and unstable. But to a mind like Luciano's, that wasn't a disaster, it was an opening. Before he ever made his first major move, Luciano understood something no one else did. Crime in New York didn't need a stronger boss. It needed a system. It needed structure. It needed someone willing to step above petty rivalries and build something on a scale the old bosses couldn't even fathom. The underworld was ready to be reshaped. It just needed the right architect. And that architect was already watching, already learning, already imagining a way to turn chaos into the most efficient criminal machine America had ever seen. He was born Salvatore Lucania in Lercora, Sicily, a place defined by dust, poverty, superstition, and a kind of hard survival that carved itself into the bones of every child. But the boy who would become Lucky Luciano did not stay in Sicily long enough to be shaped completely by it. His family, like millions of others, boarded a crowded ship and sailed into the unknown, driven by the promise of America. Yet the America they found was not the dream painted in Italian newspapers. It was the Lower East Side of Manhattan, loud, filthy, overflowing with immigrants and unforgiving to anyone too weak to defend themselves. For young Luciano, the streets became his first school. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a crucible where cultures collided and survival was a daily negotiation. Jews, Italians, Poles, Irish, every block had its own rules and its own dangers. Children grew up faster than they should have, witnessing violence, hunger, and desperation before they learned to spell their own names. Luciano learned English not from teachers but from the corners where boys gambled and cursed. He absorbed toughness like a second language. Every day taught him that power belonged to those who seized it. Even as a child, Luciano wasn't afraid to bend rules. He hated school, found discipline pointless, and preferred the energy of the streets. At around the age of 10, he was already working odd jobs, loading coal, delivering goods, carrying packages, to help his family survive. But legitimate work couldn't compete with the thrill and quick money of gambling, petty theft, and running errands for neighborhood toughs. By his early teens, Luciano had drifted firmly into the world of street crime, not because he was inherently violent, but because he recognized opportunity faster than most boys his age. One of the first defining moments of his life occurred on those streets. Luciano encountered anti-immigrant bullies frequently, Irish boys who mocked Italian kids, demanded money, or forced them to fight. Luciano refused to be victimized. He fought back again and again, sometimes winning, often losing, always learning. Over time he discovered something more valuable than fists: organization. He noticed that bullies always worked in groups. So he formed his own. He began charging other Italian kids a small fee, protection money, in exchange for safety walking home from school. It was crude, simple, and incredibly effective. At an age when most boys were still figuring out who they were, Luciano had already built his first racket. This early business revealed something essential about his psychology. He wasn't driven by brutality. He was driven by structure. He saw how fear could be redirected into profit, how alliances could be formed out of necessity, and how leadership was simply the art of offering something others needed. These small childhood schemes would eventually mirror the larger systems he built as an adult. The instincts were already there, sharp, strategic, adaptive. As he grew older, Luciano became a familiar face among the teenagers who hustled on the Lower East Side. He wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the most violent, but he had presence. He had a calm confidence, a sense of control that unnerved even older boys. And above all, he had charm. People liked him even when they shouldn't have. That ability to move effortlessly between friendliness and intimidation would become one of the defining traits of his criminal future. One of the most important friendships of his life began during these early years. Luciano met Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish kid who possessed a mathematical mind sharper than most adults. Their bond began with mutual respect. Lansky recognized Luciano's leadership, and Luciano recognized Lansky's intelligence. In a world where ethnic barriers defined everything, their friendship was unusual, almost rebellious. It was also prophetic. Together, they would one day reshape the American underworld. But even then, as teenagers, the chemistry was clear. Luciano had the street instincts while Lansky had the intellect. Together, they made a dangerous combination. It was also during this period that Luciano began mingling with another future legend, Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel. If Lansky was the brain, Siegel was the fire. Handsome, fearless, and explosively violent, Siegel embodied the raw aggression that terrified enemies. Luciano appreciated Siegel's willingness to take risks, but more importantly, he recognized potential in him. These three boys would one day form the nucleus of a criminal network that operated with precision, innovation, and ruthlessness. But at this stage, they were simply street kids carving out their territory one fistfight at a time. Then came the moment that gave him the nickname Lucky. Around 1920, Luciano was kidnapped by unknown assailants, likely rival gangsters or extortionists, beaten, stabbed multiple times, and left for dead. No one expected him to survive. Newspapers later exaggerated the incident, transforming it into a dramatic near-death legend. But what mattered was not how he was attacked, it was how he responded. Luciano survived the assault with a scarred face and a new reputation. People believed he was lucky to be alive. Luciano embraced the name, but not because he believed in luck. For him, survival was not an accident. It was proof of his resilience. The attack hardened him, sharpened him, and confirmed something he already suspected. He was destined for more than street-level hustling. By his late teens and early 20s, Luciano had evolved from a street kid into a rising figure in New York's growing criminal network. He was already dealing in drugs, running gambling operations, and building alliances. But more importantly, he had developed a worldview shaped by both hardship and observation. He understood that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. He understood that power depended on relationships, not fear alone. And he understood that the old Sicilian bosses who dominated the early Mafia were blind to the future of organized crime in America. Luciano saw America differently from them. They treated crime as family business. He saw it as industry. They enforced obedience. He encouraged collaboration. They clung to the past. He chased the future. Everything he had learned as a child, the brutality of poverty, the importance of alliances, the art of negotiation, the power of charisma, became the foundation for the empire he would one day build. But none of that was visible yet. To the outside world, he was just another ambitious street gangster. Inside, however, something was already forming. A blueprint for a new kind of underworld, something the old bosses could never have imagined. Lucky Luciano didn't rise because he was the toughest or the luckiest. He rose because he understood people. He read the streets like a language. He saw weakness, opportunity, and patterns long before others did. And slowly, quietly, methodically, he was positioning himself to climb from the chaos of the Lower East Side into the highest echelons of the criminal world, ready to reshape New York and erase anyone who dared stand in his way. By the time Prohibition swept across the United States in 1920, Lucky Luciano was no longer a hustling street kid. He was a man with ambition burning so intensely that it seemed to reshape the world around him. He understood something very few gangsters grasped at the time. America had just opened its darkest gold mine. The outlawing of alcohol created a demand so enormous that only a fully organized criminal machine could satisfy it. And Luciano intended to build that machine not with brute force but with vision. The first step in building his empire wasn't violence or intimidation, it was choosing the right people. Luciano had no interest in surrounding himself with yes-men, hotheads, or old-world traditionalists who saw crime through the narrow lens of Sicilian customs. He wanted innovators. He wanted thinkers. He wanted men who were hungry, ruthless, and smart. And he wanted them from every background. To him, ethnicity was irrelevant. Ability was everything. This is where his alliance with the Jewish mob became revolutionary. Old Italian bosses hated working with outsiders. They called Jewish gangsters infidels, foreigners, even untrustworthy. Luciano ignored them. He saw brilliance in Meyer Lansky's math-driven mind, vision in Benny Siegel's bold fearlessness, and organizational genius in Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler and fixer who would become Luciano's mentor. Rothstein wasn't a thug, he was a strategist, a negotiator, a man who moved money through the shadows of Wall Street and the underworld with ease. Luciano studied him obsessively. From Rothstein, Luciano learned that crime could be scalable, predictable, and corporate. Could function like a business. With this multi-ethnic alliance, Luciano began crafting a structure completely unlike anything that existed in New York before. The first step was consolidating rackets, not through force but through partnerships. He approached Italian, Jewish, Irish, and independent groups with the same pitch: share territory, share profits, reduce bloodshed, increase income. It was a radical idea in a world built on pride and paranoia. Many dismissed him. Others insulted him. Some even threatened him. But slowly, one by one, men realized that Luciano's approach wasn't idealistic, it was profitable. The foundation of his empire began with three major operations: liquor, gambling, and narcotics. Each required its own infrastructure: suppliers, distributors, safe houses, bribed officials, accountants, and enforcers. Luciano didn't just participate in these networks, he redesigned them. Instead of having small gangs control local territories, he centralized distribution. Instead of petty dealers making reckless decisions, he created a hierarchy of decision-makers. Instead of random violence, he encouraged selective, strategic action. This shift alone increased profits dramatically. But the structure wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. Luciano's true genius was understanding human nature. He realized that men fought over power only when they felt threatened or disrespected. So he made sure everyone felt valued. He listened. He negotiated. He smiled. He created an aura of fairness and intelligence that made others want to follow him. He learned how to read a room, how to turn enemies into allies, how to make dangerous men believe they were part of something bigger than themselves. And when charm failed, he used force, swift, direct, and absolute. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had become indispensable to some of the most powerful mob bosses in New York, including Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria. Masuria was a relic of the old world, stubborn, brutal, paranoid, stuck in Sicilian tradition. But he recognized talent, and Luciano's ability to make money made him too valuable to ignore. Luciano rose rapidly through Masuria's ranks, running bootlegging operations, coordinating gambling networks, and brokering deals that brought unprecedented revenue. Yet Luciano never saw himself as a mere lieutenant. Working under Masuria only confirmed what he already knew: the old system was broken and someone had to replace it. Luciano also embedded himself inside Salvatore Maranzano's circle, the Sicilian aristocrat and rival boss who approached crime with a Roman military mindset. Maranzano admired Luciano's intelligence and gave him responsibilities usually reserved for men twice his age. Luciano played a dangerous double game, gaining trust from both sides while gathering information, resources, and supporters. While Masuria and Maranzano prepared for the bloody Castellamarese War, a conflict that would reshape the underworld, Luciano was already envisioning the outcome: a new era where the Mafia ran like a corporation, not a feudal kingdom. The empire Luciano was building required infrastructure beyond manpower. He invested heavily in political relationships, paying off judges, cops, union leaders, and city officials. Corruption became a line item in his budget, not an afterthought. He understood that the difference between a criminal and a kingpin was influence. Money opened doors. Money bent the law. Money made the impossible achievable. Luciano distributed bribes with precision, ensuring that whenever his operations ran into trouble, the system would break in his favor. This political shield became one of the most important pillars of his empire. He also began standardizing the finances of criminal operations. No more sloppy bookkeeping. No more random cash piles hidden under beds. Luciano created financial systems, ledgers, payouts, payrolls, and investment strategies. He reinvested profits into new ventures, expanding into nightclubs, casinos, and legitimate businesses. The lines between legal and illegal blurred so deeply that even investigators struggled to track his operations. Luciano knew that money had to flow like a river, constantly moving, constantly generating more. But the empire still lacked a center, a formal organizational structure to unite the many factions under one rule. Luciano wanted a board of directors, a governing council, a system where disputes could be resolved without violence. He envisioned a national syndicate where every major mob family across the country would hold a seat. The idea was unprecedented. It required trust, cooperation, and long-term thinking, qualities many gangsters lacked. But Luciano wasn't deterred. He believed that once the old bosses fell, the younger generation, men like Lansky, Siegel, Costello, and Anastasia, would rally behind him. And he was right. As the 1920s progressed, Luciano's empire grew so quickly and efficiently that rivals began to fear him. Not because he was the most violent man in New York, but because he was the most strategic. Violence was predictable. Brute force could be countered. But Luciano's mind was a weapon no one could anticipate. He could turn enemies into partners, partners into loyalists, and loyalists into generals. He became the center of a network so vast and interconnected that removing him would destabilize half the city. Yet he remained patient. He knew that real power required timing. He needed the old bosses to destroy each other. He needed the war to weaken the traditionalists. He needed the underworld to reach a breaking point so he could offer the only solution that made sense: unity. The empire he was building wasn't just financial or territorial, it was ideological. He was creating a new version of the American Mafia, one defined not by bloodlines but by business. Behind every deal, every handshake, every strategic killing, Luciano was laying the foundation for a system that would outlive him. And soon, the moment would come when he would stop building quietly and step into the open, ready to reshape New York's criminal world forever. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had begun to emerge not just as a rising star in the criminal underworld, but as a man with the vision and intelligence to reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in New York. But any ascent to power in a world governed by guns, tradition, and ego comes with inevitable obstacles. For Luciano, these obstacles were not merely competitors, they were powerful, entrenched figures who embodied the old ways, the Sicilian codes, and the stubborn pride that had kept the Mafia fragmented for decades. Understanding these men, their psychology, and their motivations was crucial, because Luciano's brilliance lay not just in his ambition but in his ability to anticipate, manipulate, and ultimately neutralize threats. At the top of the list was Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria, a man whose reputation for brutality preceded him. Masuria was a relic of the old Sicilian system, a patriarch who ruled through fear and intimidation. His power rested on a rigid hierarchy, a strict adherence to traditional codes, and a willingness to spill blood at the slightest provocation. To him, loyalty was absolute, betrayal unforgivable, and negotiation a sign of weakness. Masuria was a man who measured strength in terms of violence and control, not strategy or profit. For many, he was untouchable, a figure whose reach and ruthlessness made him the ultimate gatekeeper to the top of the New York underworld. But to Luciano, Masuria was a calculated obstacle, a man to be studied, exploited, and eventually removed with precision. Then there was Salvatore Maranzano, an equally formidable figure who represented a different kind of threat. Maranzano came from Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily, and carried himself with the dignity and authority of a Roman general. Unlike Masuria, whose dominance relied on fear, Maranzano's power was rooted in tradition, order, and a rigid hierarchy that mirrored the structure of ancient Rome. He demanded respect and adherence to old-world rules, and he saw himself as the rightful boss of bosses, destined to unify the Italian underworld under his command. Where Masuria wielded violence recklessly, Maranzano wielded strategy with ceremonial precision. To Luciano, Maranzano's arrogance and inflexibility were vulnerabilities, and observing these flaws became part of a larger tactical plan. Beyond these two central figures were a host of lesser rivals, each with their own ambitions and grudges. Men like Stefano Megadino in Buffalo, Joe Adonis in Brooklyn, and Albert Anastasia in Manhattan all represented potential threats to Luciano's vision. Some were violent, some shrewd, some unpredictable, but all shared a fatal flaw: they were unwilling or unable to see the value of the new order Luciano envisioned. They clung to old loyalties, ethnic divisions, and brute force methods, leaving them exposed to manipulation and betrayal. Luciano understood that the problem wasn't necessarily their strength, it was their inability to adapt, to think ahead, and to operate strategically on a city-wide scale. The psychology of these rivals revealed patterns that Luciano could exploit. Masuria's paranoia made him susceptible to misinformation and planted rumors. Maranzano's pride made him overconfident, vulnerable to deception and sudden strikes. Smaller figures were driven by fear, ambition, or revenge, all of which could be redirected or pacified with promises, threats, or subtle persuasion. Luciano didn't just see enemies, he saw a network of levers and vulnerabilities. Every man had a pressure point, and every action could be orchestrated to maximize leverage. Alliances, too, were critical in this landscape. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to align himself with the right people at the right time. His partnership with Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, and other forward-thinking figures provided not only muscle and intelligence but also access to networks outside the Italian Mafia. These alliances gave him strategic options that others lacked, allowing him to navigate between rival factions, gather intelligence, and influence outcomes without always resorting to open violence. Loyalty was currency, and Luciano spent it wisely, forging bonds with men who shared his vision, or who at least recognized that aligning with him was in their own best interest. At the same time, Luciano had to carefully manage perception. He needed his rivals to underestimate him just enough to avoid premature confrontation, but not so much that they ignored him entirely. He cultivated a persona of affability, charm, and pragmatism, masking a ruthless ambition beneath a calm exterior. This duality was essential. To the old bosses, he appeared as a cooperative subordinate, a clever but non-threatening lieutenant. Behind closed doors, he was a strategist calculating every move, anticipating every reaction, and preparing contingencies for every eventuality. The dynamics between Luciano and his rivals also illustrate a recurring theme in human psychology: the tension between tradition and innovation. The older bosses clung to codes of honor, rituals, and hierarchical power, believing that loyalty alone could sustain their empires. Luciano understood that survival and dominance required more than tradition. It required innovation, adaptability, and a willingness to challenge sacred rules. This contrast between the old guard and the new visionary set the stage for conflict, betrayal, and ultimately, the reordering of the entire criminal landscape in New York. Crucially, Luciano recognized that removing his rivals would require both patience and timing. Open confrontation at the wrong moment could lead to disaster, unnecessary bloodshed, or a fractured empire. He had to wait for the perfect moment when rival factions were weakened, divided, or overconfident. Each enemy needed to be isolated, neutralized, or co-opted in a way that minimized risk and maximized gain. This approach wasn't merely tactical, it reflected a deeper understanding of strategy, psychology, and human behavior, a mind capable of seeing multiple moves ahead in a game where the stakes were life and death. Ultimately, these rivals were not just obstacles, they were the defining challenges that shaped Luciano's rise. Their strengths forced him to innovate, their flaws provided him with opportunities, their rigidity highlighted the limitations of the old system. Understanding his enemies' minds, anticipating their actions, and exploiting their weaknesses became the blueprint for his ascent. By studying these men, Luciano was not only preparing for confrontation, he was already designing the future of organized crime in New York, a system in which old loyalties would crumble, old codes would be rewritten, and a new order, with him at the center, would rise from the ashes of chaos. The Castellammarese War was not just a gangland conflict, it was a bloody civil war that tore through the streets of New York, leaving the city awash in violence, fear, and uncertainty. For decades, Italian organized crime had been a patchwork of feuding families, loosely connected by heritage and tradition, but fiercely divided by ego and territory. By the late 1920s, the simmering tension between Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano reached a boiling point, threatening to destabilize the entire underworld. Each faction believed in its inevitability of dominance, and each underestimated the cunning of the young lieutenant quietly observing the chaos, Lucky Luciano. The war itself was brutal, a relentless series of assassinations, ambushes, and retaliatory killings that swept through Italian neighborhoods from Manhattan to Brooklyn and into the outer boroughs. No corner was safe, no neighborhood immune. Civilians became collateral damage as bullets ricocheted through narrow streets and buildings became death traps for anyone associated with either faction. The atmosphere was one of paranoia, even trusted allies feared betrayal. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and the stakes were not just wealth or territory, they were survival and legacy. Amid this chaos, Luciano was calculating, watching the patterns of violence, the weaknesses in leadership, and the opportunities that only a keen mind could detect. Luciano's brilliance during this period lay in his ability to remain simultaneously involved and detached. He participated in operations under Masuria's direction, gaining credibility, experience, and the trust of those around him. Yet behind the scenes he was quietly cultivating relationships with rivals and allies alike, including members of Maranzano's faction. By navigating both sides of the conflict, he gained unprecedented access to intelligence, information that allowed him to anticipate movements, preempt attacks, and position himself for the ultimate power grab. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others reacted impulsively, he strategized. Every assassination, every skirmish, and every rumor became part of a larger calculus, feeding a plan that only he fully understood. The Castellamarese War also illuminated the generational and ideological divide within the Italian Mafia. Masuria represented the old guard, brutal, hierarchical, and rigidly Sicilian. His leadership style relied on fear and tradition, with little room for negotiation or innovation. Maranzano, on the other hand, while equally steeped in Sicilian customs, approached leadership with a militaristic precision, insisting on strict hierarchies and ceremonial authority. Both men were trapped by their adherence to outdated methods, blind to the emerging necessity for adaptability and cooperation. Luciano's insight was that these qualities, pride, inflexibility, and obsession with tradition, were exploitable vulnerabilities. By understanding their psychology, he could manipulate events in his favor without drawing suspicion. The war was also a lesson in the strategic use of violence. Luciano realized that brute force alone would never guarantee lasting power. Masuria's men killed indiscriminately, often creating more problems than they solved, while Maranzano's faction engaged in ritualized violence that reinforced hierarchy but slowed decisive action. Luciano, by contrast, applied precision. Hits were calculated, targets carefully selected, and timing meticulously planned. Assassinations were not just acts of elimination, they were psychological weapons designed to destabilize enemies, sow confusion, and consolidate influence. Each strike served a dual purpose, removing a rival while simultaneously sending a message to those watching. During this turbulent period, alliances shifted rapidly, and Luciano's understanding of human nature became his greatest asset. He identified discontented lieutenants, ambitious underbosses, and opportunistic soldiers within both factions, persuading some to switch sides, subtly undermining loyalty without arousing suspicion. He leveraged fear, respect, and the promise of profit to realign the balance of power quietly, ensuring that when the final moves were made, the opposition would be fragmented and vulnerable. His ability to navigate these treacherous waters required not only intelligence but also immense patience and psychological insight, a recognition that wars are won not only with bullets but with foresight and influence. The war also revealed the limitations of traditional mafia leadership. Masuria's reliance on fear alienated key allies, while Maranzano's obsession with hierarchy created bottlenecks in decision-making. Both men were excellent at enforcing authority but poor at innovation. Luciano, observing these deficiencies, began envisioning an alternative model, an organized network based on merit, efficiency, and cooperation rather than terror and outdated codes. The Castellamarese War was thus both a battlefield and a proving ground, where the weaknesses of old-world methods became painfully clear, and the potential for a new, modernized mafia emerged. Meanwhile, the human cost of the war was staggering. Scores of men were killed, countless others were injured or forced into hiding, and entire communities lived in fear. Every corner cafe, every back alley, every unmarked streetcar stop became a potential site of ambush. Witnesses were intimidated, informants disappeared, and trust eroded entirely. In this environment, survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and cunning. Luciano thrived under these pressures. He learned to read people, predict movements, and manipulate perceptions with uncanny accuracy. Every street confrontation, every stolen shipment, every negotiation became a piece of a larger, invisible chessboard on which he was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Ultimately, the Castellamarese War was not just a fight for territory or money, it was a contest of strategy, psychology, and vision. The old bosses were powerful, but they were predictable. Their adherence to tradition blinded them to innovation. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to exploit this blindness, to maneuver between allegiances, and to manipulate the chaos around him. The war provided the crucible in which he honed his tactics, forged critical alliances, and prepared for the decisive strikes that would allow him to emerge not just as a survivor, but as the architect of an entirely new criminal order in New York. By the time the dust settled, the city's underworld had been fundamentally altered. Mafia and Maranzano were still alive but weakened, and the groundwork had been laid for their eventual downfall. Luciano had not only survived one of the deadliest internal wars in Mafia history, he had thrived, turning a chaotic civil conflict into an opportunity for consolidation, influence, and ultimately control. The lessons of the Castellamarese War, about strategy, patience, alliance building, and psychological manipulation, would define Luciano's rise and set the stage for the calculated eliminations that would secure his position at the top of New York's criminal hierarchy. Once Lucky Luciano had observed and subtly manipulated the Castellamarese War, his attention turned to consolidating power through alliances and strategic relationships, a process as delicate and high-stakes as the blood-soaked streets he navigated. Unlike his predecessors who relied on fear and brutality to maintain control, Luciano understood that loyalty could be cultivated, nurtured, and leveraged. He saw that power was not merely a matter of muscle or reputation, it was psychological. He recognized the human need for respect, recognition, and security, and he used these insights to build a network of allies who were fiercely loyal, not because they feared him but because they trusted him to deliver protection, profit, and opportunity. His first major step was to solidify partnerships with men who shared his vision for a modernized criminal enterprise. Meyer Lansky, with his cold analytical mind and unparalleled ability to manipulate numbers and logistics, became a crucial ally. Together, they mapped out operations across multiple boroughs, combining Lansky's financial genius with Luciano's street instincts. Benny Bugsy Siegel, volatile yet brilliant, provided the muscle and audacity needed for high-risk ventures. These men were not merely sidekicks, they were architects of a new order, men who understood that strength alone could not secure dominance in a city where alliances shifted like sand. Luciano's ability to manage relationships extended beyond his immediate circle. He approached rival mobsters with a pragmatism that many found unnerving. To Mafia loyalists, he presented himself as an obedient lieutenant, a dependable operative who could advance their interests. To those aligned with Maranzano, he positioned himself as a mediator capable of bridging gaps and smoothing disputes. By walking this tightrope, Luciano gained critical intelligence while simultaneously avoiding the suspicion that often proved fatal in the Mafia world. He cultivated the perception that he was cooperative, trustworthy, and above the petty quarrels consuming the older generation. At the same time, he recognized that alliances were fragile and required constant maintenance. He invested in symbolic gestures, gifts, gestures of trust, and public shows of solidarity to reinforce bonds. But he was also ruthless when necessary, removing those whose loyalty wavered or whose ambition threatened to undermine his plans. In Luciano's world, betrayal was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. Anticipating it, preparing for it, and acting decisively were essential components of leadership. Luciano's genius lay in understanding the psychological dynamics of power. He grasped that fear could be a tool, but respect and mutual benefit created permanence. A gangster who follows you out of fear today may betray you tomorrow, but one who follows you out of trust and shared gain becomes a partner for life. By carefully balancing intimidation with diplomacy, Luciano created a hierarchy in which ambition was encouraged, but defection was costly. He rewarded loyalty with opportunity, visibility, and influence, ensuring that his inner circle felt invested in his success. The careful cultivation of allies also extended to political and business figures. Luciano recognized early on that the Mafia could not thrive in isolation from the city's broader systems. Judges, law enforcement officials, union leaders, and politicians were all part of a web that could either protect or destroy him. By offering subtle bribes, favors, and strategic partnerships, he created a network that not only shielded his operations but also expanded their reach. Power in New York was never solely in the hands of the mob, it depended on symbiotic relationships across the legal and illegal spheres, and Luciano was a master at weaving these threads. Rivalries, however, could not be eliminated entirely. As his influence grew, so too did resentment among older bosses and ambitious younger figures. Men who once overlooked him now regarded him as a threat. Stefano Megadino, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and others watched his rise warily, unsure whether to ally with him or oppose him. Each move Luciano made was calculated to test loyalties, gather intelligence, and assess risk. He often relied on subtle manipulation, planting doubts, spreading rumors, and exploiting insecurities, to divide opposition and weaken potential threats. One of his most brilliant strategies was turning enemies into allies by appealing to their self-interest. He offered partnerships that were too profitable to refuse, framing collaboration as mutually beneficial rather than subjugation. By creating a network of interdependent players, Luciano reduced the incentive for betrayal and simultaneously expanded his reach. Men who once considered him a subordinate now became collaborators in a larger vision, a testament to his ability to perceive and manipulate motivations at every level. Yet, alliances in the Mafia were never stable. Betrayal was always possible, and violence often punctuated even the most solid relationships. Luciano navigated this reality with calculated risk-taking. He allowed conflicts to simmer, observing how men reacted under pressure, who would remain loyal and who would crack. He rarely engaged impulsively, instead he measured every interaction, weighing its long-term consequences. In doing so, he transformed alliance building into an art form, a complex blend of psychology, strategy, and opportunism. This network of allies and manipulated rivals created an environment in which Luciano could exercise influence across multiple fronts without appearing overtly dominant. He became the linchpin of New York's underworld, a man whose opinion, approval, and partnership mattered more than brute force. Through loyalty, fear, calculation, and vision, Luciano turned potential chaos into a manageable system, positioning himself to not only survive but to define the very rules of power in the city. By the late 1920s, his alliances had solidified, his rivals were wary, and his network was operationally efficient. The stage was set for him to consolidate ultimate control. The lessons of patience, observation, and strategic alliance forged during this period would define his methods for decades. Luciano understood that the Mafia could no longer be a fractured collection of violent clans. It needed structure, collaboration, and the careful balancing of human psychology. His mastery of these dynamics marked him as a leader unlike any the underworld had ever seen, and it was this combination of intellect, charisma, and ruthless pragmatism that would allow him to emerge as the uncontested architect of modern organized crime. Even the most carefully constructed empires face moments of chaos, and for Lucky Luciano, the late 1920s represented a period in which hidden wars raged on multiple fronts, wars that were as psychological and strategic as they were violent. While the Castellammarese War had already set the stage for his rise, the underworld itself was still a landscape of shifting allegiances, clandestine operations, and invisible battles. These conflicts were hidden from the public eye, unreported by newspapers, and often conducted in silence. For Luciano, mastering this hidden war required foresight, patience, and an acute understanding of human nature, qualities that would allow him to survive when others fell. The hidden war operated on several levels. On the surface, rival factions competed for territory, gambling rackets, and bootlegging operations. Beneath the surface, however, it was a battle of influence, psychology, and information. Luciano knew that controlling the streets wasn't enough. He had to control perception. Every rumor, every whisper, every betrayal had to be accounted for. Missteps could be fatal. In a city where violence was a constant risk, intelligence was the ultimate weapon. Luciano's ability to gather information on both allies and enemies allowed him to anticipate threats before they became crises, giving him a decisive advantage in an environment where others reacted only after blood was spilled. One key aspect of the hidden war was infiltration. Luciano understood that the best way to weaken rivals was not through open confrontation alone, but through embedding spies and informants within their ranks. Trusted lieutenants and operatives gathered intelligence on rival operations, noting shipment routes, financial records, and loyalties. Luciano could then manipulate events from a distance, redirect shipments, sow mistrust, or strike strategically at moments of vulnerability. Unlike the indiscriminate violence of older bosses, this approach minimized risk and maximized effectiveness. Every move was a calculated step in a larger game of chess, with human lives as the pawns, knights, and bishops. The war was also fought in the shadows of political and legal systems. Luciano maintained delicate relationships with corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians, ensuring that he had eyes and ears within the very institutions designed to suppress him. These contacts allowed him to anticipate raids, prevent arrests, and manipulate the enforcement of laws to his advantage. Conversely, he could also use threats or influence to destabilize rival factions by alerting authorities selectively or encouraging legal action against their operations. In this hidden battlefield, control over perception, information, and timing was as important as control over territory or resources. Luciano's strategic mind extended to human behavior itself. He understood that fear could be wielded as a weapon, but that respect and trust were far more powerful for long-term dominance. He carefully assessed the ambitions and weaknesses of his rivals, identifying those who could be turned, neutralized, or eliminated with minimal cost. For example, discontented lieutenants within Masuria's faction were subtly enticed to switch allegiances, creating cracks in the enemy's foundation without initiating full-scale conflict. Others were manipulated through misinformation, creating paranoia and forcing mistakes that weakened their positions. In this way, Luciano was not just fighting a physical war, he was orchestrating psychological battles that determined the outcome before a single gunshot was fired. The hidden war also required Luciano to manage his own organization with precision. Allies and lieutenants had to be carefully monitored, motivated, and disciplined. He instituted systems for communication, coordination, and accountability that allowed his network to operate efficiently even under pressure. This level of operational control was unprecedented. While older bosses relied on fear or tradition to maintain cohesion, Luciano built loyalty through structure, opportunity, and calculated rewards. Those who succeeded within his system became invested in his vision, while those who faltered or threatened stability were quietly removed. As the war unfolded, Luciano remained patient. He knew that timing was everything. Premature action could spark unnecessary bloodshed, jeopardize alliances, or alert rivals to his true intentions. He allowed the chaos to unfold, observing patterns, gauging reactions, and planning decisive moves that would consolidate power with minimal exposure. Every assassination, every shift in alliance, and every negotiation was part of a larger, meticulously constructed strategy aimed at creating an underworld that operated not on fear alone, but on efficiency, loyalty, and calculated influence. By the late 1920s, the hidden war had already transformed Luciano. He had become a master of subtle manipulation, understanding that power was most effectively exercised not through public displays of force, but through control over information, perception, and human psychology. He was able to turn rivals into allies, allies into generals, and chaos into a system that served his vision. While the city's older bosses fought battles that were visible, chaotic, and destructive, Luciano mastered a war fought in the shadows, one that left him stronger, smarter, and better prepared for the final moves that would secure his domination of New York's underworld. The psychological dimension of this war cannot be overstated. Every action Luciano took was designed to produce both immediate results and long-term effects on loyalty, fear, and influence. By manipulating perceptions, he created an aura of inevitability around his rise. Rivals hesitated, allies deferred to his judgment, and observers came to believe that his ascendancy was preordained. In this environment, control over knowledge equaled control over power, and Luciano's mind became the ultimate weapon. He was no longer simply a gangster. He was a strategist, a conductor of human behavior, and an architect of outcomes that others could only react to. Through these hidden battles, Luciano solidified the foundation of a modern criminal empire. Violence, while still necessary, became a tool rather than the defining principle of leadership. Alliances were leveraged, betrayals anticipated, and influence extended into both legitimate and illicit spheres of the city. By the time the visible confrontations of the Castellamarese War concluded, Luciano had already won the more important, invisible battles. He had positioned himself at the center of a network that would soon become unassailable, proving that in the world of organized crime, true power lies not in fear alone, but in mastery over strategy, psychology, and the hidden levers of influence. Even the most carefully orchestrated empires are fragile when the law turns its gaze in earnest, and for Lucky Luciano, the late 1930s marked the beginning of a period that would test his genius, patience, and resilience in ways the streets had never demanded. Despite his meticulous planning, the forces of law and government were advancing, increasingly sophisticated and relentless, determined to dismantle the networks he had built with painstaking precision. Luciano's criminal empire had grown too visible, too profitable, and too influential to remain entirely beyond scrutiny. The hidden war, the calculated alliances, and the orchestration of rival eliminations had brought him immense power, but power always attracts attention, and for Luciano the consequences were now unavoidable. The fall began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Investigators, driven by political pressure and public outrage over organized crime, started connecting the dots. Jack, Legs, Diamond, and other smaller criminal figures were scrutinized, wiretaps were installed, and confidential informants began to provide details that had previously gone unnoticed. Luciano's operations, sprawling and multi-layered as they were, had cracks. No system, no matter how well managed, is perfect when thousands of lives, loyalties, and transactions intersect daily. It was inevitable that human error, betrayals, and investigative persistence would converge. Then came the arrests, each one signaling a tightening net. Soldiers, lieutenants, and even trusted allies were apprehended or indicted, often as part of plea deals or cooperative arrangements with law enforcement. Each arrest sent ripples through Luciano's organization, forcing him to reassess security, reallocate resources, and anticipate further disruption. The psychological pressure of seeing trusted men imprisoned or cooperating with authorities weighed heavily. For a man whose empire relied on loyalty and discretion, these moments were not mere inconveniences, they were existential threats. Luciano understood, however, that panic was a luxury he could not afford. In his mind, every crisis was another opportunity for control. Betrayal, the specter that had always haunted the Mafia, now loomed closer than ever. As federal authorities applied pressure, some of Luciano's inner circle began to consider cooperation as a survival strategy. Informants emerged, often reluctantly, revealing operational details, financial records, and logistical information. These breaches tested Luciano's control over human behavior. Some men could be reminded of the benefits of loyalty, others had to be eliminated quietly and decisively. The stakes had escalated beyond street-level disputes. The very architecture of his criminal empire was under siege. The pressures of legal scrutiny also intersected with public perception and media attention. Newspapers sensationalized arrests, trials, and underworld violence, painting Luciano as both a mastermind and a menace. The coverage heightened government determination, fueled public outrage, and made him a target for a coordinated campaign to dismantle the Mafia. For Luciano, reputation had always been a tool. It had projected strength and discouraged rivals. Now it had become a double-edged sword. The visibility that once secured respect now attracted federal agents, ambitious prosecutors, and political opportunists eager to make examples of him. Amid these pressures, Luciano faced one of the most consequential moments of his life. His arrest for compulsory prostitution violations, commonly referred to at the time as running a vice ring. The charges, though narrower in scope than his full criminal activities, provided authorities with a legal foothold to pursue him aggressively. Federal and state prosecutors framed the case as part of a broader effort to crush organized crime in New York. The arrest was carefully calculated to strike at his economic infrastructure, his ability to communicate with lieutenants, and his psychological hold over subordinates. It was a direct assault on the very system he had spent years constructing. Yet, even under arrest, Luciano demonstrated his trademark combination of intelligence, foresight, and resilience. He understood that the law could remove him physically, but it could not immediately dismantle the intricate networks he had built. From jail, he maintained communication with key lieutenants, delegated responsibilities, and continued to orchestrate operations. He had always treated loyalty as currency and organization as a fortress. Now these principles allowed him to survive politically and operationally while the trial process unfolded. But the personal cost was undeniable. The empire he had meticulously cultivated, the alliances, the influence, the carefully balanced relationships, was now vulnerable to unraveling. Every move had to be measured, every contact carefully controlled. Fear of betrayal became more than a tool, it became a daily reality. Allies who had once been steadfast were now facing their own legal battles, and some began to consider arrangements with the authorities. For a man whose identity and power were inseparable, this was a period of intense psychological strain. Luciano had to remain composed, projecting calm even as the walls closed in around him. The fall was also strategic from the perspective of his enemies. Remaining rivals saw an opportunity to challenge his supremacy while he was constrained by law enforcement scrutiny. Old guard bosses, opportunistic subordinates, and ambitious upstarts all tested boundaries, probing weaknesses that had never existed before. Luciano's ability to maintain control in this period of stress, to coordinate responses without panicking, and to anticipate moves before they were made, was crucial. It illustrated that power was not merely a function of dominance, but also of adaptability, foresight, and psychological endurance. In essence, the fall of Lucky Luciano began not with a dramatic shootout or a betrayal, but with the slow tightening of external pressures, legal, political, and psychological, combined with the internal fragility that comes from years of operating on the edge of law and trust. His arrest, the betrayals of some allies, and the relentless pressure from authorities marked the first stage in a carefully orchestrated decline. A decline that would test every skill he had cultivated on the streets, in boardrooms, and in the hidden corridors of power. Yet even as the beginning of his downfall emerged, Luciano's genius remained intact. He understood that survival depended not on panicking or resisting passively, but on strategic maneuvering, psychological insight, and leveraging every advantage available. The fall was inevitable, but it would not be without a battle fought with intellect, influence, and unyielding resolve. And in this crucible, the lessons of patience, observation, and calculated risk-taking that had defined his rise would now determine whether the man who reshaped the Mafia could survive its greatest challenges. The courtroom was electric, a pressure cooker of tension, anticipation, and spectacle that would etch Lucky Luciano's name permanently into the annals of both organized crime and American legal history. By the time the trial began, the public had been primed to view him not simply as a criminal, but as the personification of a sprawling, sophisticated underworld that had infiltrated every corner of New York City. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, editors and columnists debated his guilt with a mixture of fear and fascination, and ordinary citizens followed every development as if they were witnessing a gladiatorial battle between law and chaos. The trial was about more than legal proceedings. It was a theater in which the fate of the Mafia, the credibility of law enforcement, and the mythos of Lucky Luciano would collide. From the outset, the prosecution framed Luciano as the central architect of organized vice in the city. He was painted as a mastermind who orchestrated prostitution rings, gambling operations, and illegal liquor distribution with a cold, calculating efficiency. Witnesses, many of whom were former associates, testified to the inner workings of his empire, revealing not only the scope of his criminal reach but the meticulous planning that underpinned it. Each testimony was delivered with the dual purpose of proving his guilt and dismantling the aura of invincibility he had cultivated. The courtroom became a stage where personal betrayals were exposed, alliances tested, and reputations both revered and destroyed. The defense, however, was prepared and deliberate. Luciano's lawyers argued that the charges were narrowly defined and did not encompass the full extent of his criminal activity, framing the prosecution's case as circumstantial and reliant on unreliable witnesses. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every assertion was scrutinized, cross-examined, and dissected. For Luciano, the trial was a chess game in which he could not control the players, but could anticipate their moves. His reputation as a strategic thinker extended into the courtroom. He remained composed, projecting an image of calm and rationality even as the stakes rose with each passing day. Media attention amplified every nuance. Photographers captured him entering the courthouse with a composed, almost nonchalant demeanor. Journalists described his appearance, mannerisms, and demeanor in detail, creating a narrative of a man simultaneously charming, dangerous, and unflinchingly confident. The public perception became part of the battle, as newspapers and radio broadcasts created a psychological backdrop that shaped both jury sentiment and the strategies of attorneys on both sides. Luciano understood that perception was power, and he leveraged it silently, allowing his composure and reputation to influence observers outside the courtroom as much as within it. As the trial progressed, the human drama unfolded. Testimonies revealed shocking betrayals, intimate knowledge of operations, and the depth of loyalty and treachery within his organization. Allies who had once been close confidants now portrayed him as ruthless and manipulative, while some adversaries attempted to capitalize on the opportunity to settle old scores or claim moral superiority. Each day of testimony layered additional tension, highlighting the precarious balance between power and vulnerability. Luciano's calculated calmness contrasted sharply with the emotional outbursts, fear, and self-interest displayed by others, reinforcing his psychological advantage. The courtroom also became a theater of strategic maneuvering. Luciano's legal team used procedural tactics, technical challenges, and persuasive rhetoric to destabilize the prosecution's narrative. Witness credibility was challenged, evidence carefully dissected, and inconsistencies emphasized. Luciano himself played a subtle but crucial role, maintaining composure, providing information when necessary, and allowing his lawyers to orchestrate the narrative of a man wrongly accused, or at least someone whose criminal empire could not be definitively proven in court. Every gesture, every word, every pause was a calculated signal, demonstrating that even under intense pressure, he remained in command. The sentence, when it finally came, was a pivotal moment. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to a significant term in prison, a dramatic fall from the heights of power he had meticulously constructed. The courtroom erupted in reactions that reflected the public's fascination, fear, and moral outrage. For Luciano, the conviction marked not merely a personal setback, but a crucial turning point in the narrative of his empire. The trial had publicly confirmed the existence of his operations, exposed his methods, and forced him into a new kind of challenge, one that would test his ability to lead, manipulate, and survive under confinement. Yet even in the courtroom, Luciano's mind was already at work, envisioning how to transform what seemed like defeat into a different kind of victory. He understood that incarceration would limit his physical freedom, but it could not immediately dismantle the intricate systems he had constructed. His influence, carefully nurtured over years of alliances and strategic relationships, could be leveraged even behind bars. The trial, while ostensibly a stage for judgment, became for him a proving ground for psychological resilience, strategic foresight, and the ability to turn adversity into opportunity. The trial also solidified Luciano's mythos. Public fascination with his intelligence, composure, and audacity only grew, blurring the lines between criminal infamy and celebrity. For law enforcement, the case represented a significant victory, but for Luciano, it was a challenge to be managed, a disruption to be mitigated, and a stage upon which he would continue to demonstrate his strategic brilliance. Even as the gavel fell, his influence extended beyond the courtroom walls, shaping the underworld and sending a message to allies and rivals alike. Lucky Luciano's fall was not total, because true power could survive even imprisonment. Ultimately, the trial and sentence represented a critical juncture, a convergence of law, media, psychology, and organized crime. They underscored the consequences of ambition, the fragility of loyalty, and the limits of brute force in an increasingly interconnected and scrutinized underworld. For Luciano, the experience would become another chapter in a career defined not just by violence or control, but by intelligence, strategy, and the remarkable ability to adapt under extreme pressure, a skill set that would allow him to continue shaping the criminal world even from behind prison walls. Even behind the heavy iron bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence over New York's criminal underworld remained far from diminished. While most men would see incarceration as a total loss of control, Luciano treated it as a different kind of battlefield, one where patience, intellect, and psychological manipulation were as effective as any weapon on the streets. From the very beginning of his imprisonment, he established himself not as a powerless prisoner, but as a strategic hub, coordinating operations, maintaining loyalty, and continuing to exert power over his empire through intermediaries, coded messages, and trusted lieutenants. The prison environment itself posed unique challenges. Inmates were unpredictable, guards were constantly observing, and communication was tightly controlled. Yet Luciano adapted quickly. He cultivated relationships with guards, identifying those susceptible to bribery, persuasion, or intimidation, creating channels that allowed messages to flow in and out. Every interaction was calculated. A seemingly casual conversation could plant a seed, test loyalty, or gather critical information about conditions outside the walls. For Luciano, prison was not confinement, it was a high-stakes chessboard, where every move counted, and every human interaction could be leveraged for strategic advantage. Maintaining loyalty from outside operatives was equally critical. His network of lieutenants, soldiers, and associates were tasked with managing day-to-day operations while ensuring that the empire remained cohesive. Luciano's instructions were precise, often delivered through trusted intermediaries who understood the importance of discretion. These communications were layered with subtle psychological cues, a hint here, a warning there, a reminder of rewards or consequences. Men who had once followed him in the streets now continued to obey from afar, drawn not by fear alone, but by the careful cultivation of respect, trust, and mutual interest. Psychologically, this period demonstrated Luciano's unmatched ability to maintain authority under extreme pressure. While other mob bosses might crumble under incarceration, succumbing to fear, frustration, or despair, Luciano projected calm and purpose. Stories of his composed demeanor spread among both inmates and guards, reinforcing the perception that he remained untouchable, even behind bars. This aura of invincibility was itself a tool, dissuading potential challengers and reinforcing loyalty among his subordinates. In essence, Luciano had converted the prison into a stage upon which he could continue to perform the role of a master strategist, maintaining influence without exposing himself to the immediate dangers of street-level violence. The logistical side of his empire also required constant attention. Bootlegging, gambling, and union manipulation, all key sources of revenue, could not afford disruption. Luciano delegated operational authority carefully, ensuring that trusted lieutenants executed tasks according to his vision. He established a hierarchy of accountability, regularly assessing performance through coded reports and discreet inquiries. Mistakes were met with consequences, but loyalty was rewarded handsomely, reinforcing the system's structure even as he remained physically removed. This approach demonstrated his foresight. A criminal enterprise was not merely a collection of men and money, it was a living network requiring management, oversight, and constant adaptation. At the same time, Luciano began to observe the weaknesses of his rivals from a distance. He realized that many were overconfident, complacent, or lacking in strategic foresight. By remaining imprisoned but operational, he gained an unexpected advantage: invisibility combined with oversight. While his enemies engaged in open displays of power or fell victim to impulsive decisions, Luciano's network continued to operate smoothly, giving him leverage for future negotiations and eventual resurgence. His empire was not stagnant, it was adapting, consolidating, and learning under his invisible guidance. Luciano's ability to manipulate perception extended beyond his immediate organization. Law enforcement, prosecutors, and the media all observed his every move, interpreting silence as weakness or defiance as arrogance. Luciano leveraged these perceptions carefully. He maintained an outward appearance of compliance while subtly signaling to allies that control and influence remained intact. In doing so, he turned even the constraints of incarceration into a strategic advantage, demonstrating that leadership was as much about perception and psychological influence as it was about physical presence. Importantly, Luciano also began to envision the long-term evolution of his criminal empire during this period. He recognized that survival depended on restructuring operations to minimize exposure to law enforcement while maximizing efficiency and profitability. The prison became a place of planning and reflection, where he could evaluate weaknesses, refine strategies, and prepare for the eventual transition from confinement back to freedom. Every legal challenge, every disruption, every setback was assessed not as an end, but as a component in the larger arc of maintaining and expanding power. Through these methods, Luciano proved that true authority was not constrained by walls, bars, or physical limitations. His control over operations, alliances, and information ensured that even imprisonment could not halt the flow of his influence. Soldiers remained loyal, territories remained productive, and rivals were monitored and manipulated from afar. Luciano's time behind bars reinforced a critical lesson. Leadership in the underworld was not defined solely by physical dominance, but by strategic intelligence, psychological acuity, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes through both direct and indirect influence. By the time he had served several years, Luciano's empire was intact and arguably stronger in structure than before his incarceration. The networks he had nurtured continued to function efficiently, and his foresight in cultivating both human and operational capital ensured that he retained ultimate authority. Prison had not diminished him, it had refined his approach, allowing him to demonstrate the extraordinary capacity to maintain power under constraint, turning a potential weakness into one of his greatest strengths. In the eyes of both allies and enemies, Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with, a man whose intellect, patience, and strategic genius transcended the confines of any cell. After serving several years behind bars, Lucky Luciano faced a challenge unlike any he had encountered on the streets: exile. Deported to Italy in 1946, he was thrust into a world unfamiliar yet deeply connected to his roots. While some saw exile as a final punishment, a symbolic stripping of power, Luciano perceived it differently. He understood that influence was not strictly tied to physical presence. It was a product of networks, strategy, and the ability to manipulate circumstances. Even from afar, he remained a central figure in organized crime, albeit one who now had to navigate the subtleties of international politics, post-war reconstruction, and a mafia landscape evolving in ways he had not previously experienced. Italy in the immediate post-war period was chaotic. The country was recovering from the devastation of World War II, with social, economic, and political structures in flux. For Luciano, this environment presented both risks and opportunities. On one hand, he was under constant scrutiny by local authorities and international law enforcement, a reminder that his reach was constrained. On the other hand, the instability offered avenues for influence. He quickly understood that Italy, with its fragmented criminal networks and emerging global connections, could be leveraged to maintain relevance in the global underworld. Luciano approached exile not as confinement but as a new frontier, a place where his experience, intelligence, and connections could create influence on an international scale. During this period, Luciano's networks became more sophisticated. He maintained contact with American operatives, ensuring that business continued across the Atlantic. Communications were discreet, often routed through intermediaries and trusted couriers. Despite physical separation, Luciano orchestrated operations that spanned continents, showing that the principles of power he had mastered in New York, strategic alliances, loyalty management, and calculated risk, could be applied in a far more complex geopolitical context. He became a bridge between the American Mafia and emerging criminal enterprises in Europe, consolidating influence and expanding reach even from exile. Exile also offered Luciano time for reflection and recalibration. Removed from the immediate pressures of law enforcement, rival factions, and street-level violence, he could analyze the trajectory of his life, empire, and decisions. It was a period of philosophical transformation, where the lessons of power, loyalty, and human nature crystallized into a deeper understanding of leadership. He recognized that his identity was inseparable from his ability to influence, to strategize, and to survive in systems governed as much by psychology and perception as by force. Even in exile he remained Luciano, the architect, the strategist, the unseen hand guiding complex operations. The endgame of this period involved balancing patience with ambition. Luciano could not simply return to New York and reclaim his empire. The world had changed and old rivals had grown more entrenched. He carefully nurtured relationships with allies, monitored the shifting dynamics of organized crime, and leveraged his historical knowledge to predict opportunities. He recognized that influence could be exercised subtly, through diplomacy, financial leverage, and strategic counsel, rather than through the violence and intimidation that had defined his earlier rise. In many ways, exile became a laboratory for testing the limits of non-physical power, demonstrating that the mind could operate over vast distances, manipulating human behavior, alliances, and operations with precision. Luciano's personal life during exile was equally complex. Removed from the adrenaline and immediacy of street power, he had to adapt to a slower, more cerebral existence. Yet he never lost the presence of mind required to remain relevant. Visitors, intermediaries, and even occasional law enforcement contacts became channels through which he could extend influence, gather intelligence, and subtly shape outcomes. The exile forced a transition from direct action to indirect mastery, a shift that demanded patience, strategic vision, and psychological acuity. The broader historical context also influenced his endgame. Post-war Italy was a nation in reconstruction, with global attention focused on rebuilding political and economic systems. Luciano leveraged this environment to reassert influence, aligning interests with both criminal and political actors who were navigating uncertainty. Through careful observation, negotiation, and subtle manipulation, he positioned himself as a key figure in the evolving transatlantic criminal landscape. He became not just a survivor of exile, but an architect of global influence, proving that leadership transcends borders, imprisonment, and even forced displacement. Ultimately, Luciano's exile marked the culmination of a lifetime of strategic thinking. He transformed what could have been total defeat into a platform for continued relevance, demonstrating that power is as much about adaptability and foresight as it is about territory or muscle. The exile allowed him to shift from being a street-level operative to a global strategist, applying lessons learned in New York to an increasingly interconnected world. It was a period of reflection, recalibration, and quiet expansion, showing that even in apparent loss, Luciano remained the ultimate tactician, capable of bending circumstances to his will and preserving influence on a scale few could comprehend. By the time he spent his final years in Italy, Luciano had redefined what it meant to wield power. Exile had not broken him, it had refined him. He had learned to operate across borders, to manipulate perception, to orchestrate influence from afar, and to turn adversity into opportunity. His endgame was not the violent, visible dominance of his youth, but the subtle, enduring authority of a master strategist who understood that true power is timeless, adaptable, and unbound by walls, countries, or circumstance. Lucky Luciano's legacy is both monumental and paradoxical, a testament to genius and brutality, vision and ruthlessness, innovation and moral ambiguity. By the time of his death, he had transformed the American underworld in ways that continue to reverberate decades later. What made Luciano extraordinary was not simply his capacity for violence or his ability to command loyalty, but his unparalleled talent for structuring chaos into order. Before him, organized crime in New York was fragmented, tribal, and reactive, a series of feuds, vendettas, and power struggles that often led to short-lived dominance. Luciano, however, envisioned something different, a systematized, hierarchical, yet flexible enterprise that combined discipline, profit orientation, and strategic alliances. In doing so, he created the blueprint for the modern mafia, a network that could survive law enforcement pressure, internal betrayal, and generational transitions. Luciano's innovations extended beyond operational efficiency. He introduced the concept of the Commission, a governing council that mediated disputes, enforced rules, and ensured that violence was employed strategically rather than impulsively. This structure reduced internecine warfare, stabilized operations, and created a system in which different families could coexist profitably under shared rules. The Commission was revolutionary not only for its organizational sophistication, but also for its implicit psychological understanding. Power was no longer a zero-sum game. It could be negotiated, balanced, and managed. This approach transformed the nature of criminal enterprise, elevating it from mere street-level thuggery to an organized, corporate-like network capable of generating immense wealth while maintaining internal order. Luciano also redefined the relationship between crime and society. He understood that influence extended beyond the streets and into unions, politicians, and law enforcement. By embedding his operations within legitimate systems, often through subtle manipulation, bribery, and strategic alliances, he blurred the boundaries between legality and illegality, creating a network that could operate efficiently under the radar of authorities. This duality became a hallmark of his legacy, the ability to exert influence without overtly revealing the full scope of his power, a lesson in control, subtlety, and strategic foresight. Perhaps most striking was Luciano's psychological mastery. He understood human behavior at an intimate level, what motivated men, how fear and respect interacted, and how loyalty could be cultivated and exploited. Unlike previous crime bosses who ruled through terror alone, Luciano combined intimidation with opportunity, loyalty with incentive, and brutality with strategic vision. Soldiers, lieutenants, and even rivals became part of a system in which each individual's ambition was harnessed rather than suppressed. This psychological sophistication allowed him to maintain cohesion, adapt to changing circumstances, and survive pressures that had destroyed lesser leaders. His genius lay in transforming personal insight into organizational architecture, a skill that ensured his influence endured long after he left the streets. Luciano's influence was global in scope. His methods and innovations crossed the Atlantic, shaping organized crime in Europe and laying the groundwork for transnational criminal networks. Even during exile, he remained a strategic force, guiding operations, alliances, and influence through intermediaries and trusted operatives. The systems he established were resilient, adaptable, and enduring, demonstrating that his impact was not confined to New York or even to his lifetime. The Mafia he shaped became an institution, a network of power, and a model emulated in cities around the world. At the same time, Luciano's legacy is a study in paradox. He was ruthless and calculating, yet visionary, violent and feared, yet intelligent and strategic, morally ambiguous yet admired for his organizational brilliance. He personified contrasts: fear versus respect, loyalty versus betrayal, power versus survival. These tensions defined his life and continue to define his mythos. He has been romanticized as a criminal genius, vilified as a ruthless gangster, and analyzed as a psychological case study in leadership and strategy. Each perspective captures only a fragment of the man, yet together they reflect the complexity of a figure who reshaped an entire underworld. Historically, his methods influenced not just criminals but law enforcement, sociologists, and policymakers. Studying Luciano provides insight into the dynamics of organized power, the interplay of human psychology and structural control, and the mechanisms through which illegal enterprises can persist across generations. His life serves as a cautionary tale and a blueprint, illustrating the allure of power, the consequences of ambition, and the importance of strategic thinking, adaptability, and foresight. In cultural memory, Luciano has become an archetype of the modern crime boss: intelligent, ruthless, innovative, and profoundly strategic. Movies, books, and documentaries repeatedly revisit his story, emphasizing not only his criminal achievements but the lessons in human behavior, leadership, and organizational strategy that emerge from his life. Unlike many of his contemporaries whose influence faded with death or imprisonment, Luciano's impact persisted, shaping both the structure and perception of organized crime in ways that remain relevant to this day. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is a study in power, its construction, exercise, and endurance. He proved that authority is not merely a function of violence, but of vision, psychology, strategy, and adaptability. He showed that chaos can be transformed into order, that loyalty can be engineered, and that influence can transcend physical presence. His life is both a historical record and a psychological case study, a narrative of brilliance and brutality intertwined, leaving behind a blueprint for the modern criminal world and a complex portrait of a man who redefined the rules of power. In the final analysis, Luciano's story is not simply about crime. It is about the human capacity to understand systems, manipulate behavior, and reshape environments to one's advantage. His legacy endures because he mastered not just the streets, but the minds and ambitions of those around him, crafting an empire that was at once fragile and resilient, violent and sophisticated, feared and admired. Lucky Luciano did not merely lead. He revolutionized the very concept of organized power, leaving a mark that history continues to reckon with even decades after his death. As the story of Lucky Luciano concludes, we are left with a portrait of a man who mastered power, strategy, and human psychology. His rise from street-level chaos to the architect of the modern mafia demonstrates a rare combination of intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. Even in exile, he continued to influence criminal networks, proving that true authority transcends physical presence. Luciano's life was a constant negotiation between loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect, ambition and consequence. The conclusion of his story highlights the enduring impact of his innovations. The commission, strategic alliances, and the systematic organization of crime transformed the underworld from chaotic factions into a resilient, hierarchical network. He understood that perception and influence were as powerful as force, and he wielded both expertly. While feared and romanticized, Luciano left behind lessons in leadership, strategy, and human behavior that remain relevant. Ultimately, his legacy is a study in contrasts: power versus vulnerability, myth versus man, violence versus intellect. Lucky Luciano's story is not just about crime. It is about the art of influence, the structure of systems, and the enduring consequences of ambition. His life offers a cinematic, psychologically rich reflection on how a single individual can reshape an entire world through strategy, foresight, and understanding of human nature.